Vera, Bridget, and Zathena. Such small names for such large factors. One must understand that few alive at the time of their arrival were there for the beginning of the war, but many of that time would see the end of it. Well, perhaps not the end of the war, but of the war before the war, that preluded the war foretold to end all wars. Wars, war. Such a funny word, war, but hardly humorous in practice, I dare say. Either way, the Alathians, in line with their more reserved ways, dared not risk an untrained and so newly obtained asset so quickly. The Anarans, however... Oh, the Anarans. The observations of an over-observed observationist. Chapter 1. Alathians and Anarans. Bridget, a woman's best weapons. She awoke to a dimly lit stone room. She forced her swollen eyes open, with even the small amount of light causing her to squint. She began to feel around, trying to get her bearings. The material around her was soft, like some sort of silk. She could tell it was a bed. Her head was resting on a pillow, and she was laid on her back. She managed to tilt her head to the right, and saw a large window, with crimson velvet curtains swaying in the wind. To her left, she found large double doors that were shut tight. She could only assume that they were locked from the other side. She brought her hands in front of her face and saw that they were covered in bandages, except the fingertips. She put them to her face and felt the deep, jagged scratches running where the wolf's claws had been. She didn't think that they would scar too badly. Her stomach, on the other hand, was likely a different story. She managed to very weakly lift herself onto her elbows so that she could see the damage. Thick white bandages were wrapped around her stomach. Blood had soaked itself through in horizontal lines. After a brief moment of examination, she decided that it was high time she got to her feet. She rolled over slowly, fighting the sore pain that racked her body until she was able to throw her legs over the side, forcing herself to stand. Her stomach was in agony, feeling like all of the muscle had either been ripped out or lit on fire. She stumbled her way over to a mirror that was on the other end of the room in the direction of the foot of the bed. It had been covered by a curtain that was of the same material as the one that covered the window before she tore it away. She took a few steps back, trying to get a full view of the damage done to her. Her feet were covered in bandages that wrapped around her to her mid-calves. She could only assume that cuts and bruises were hidden beneath. And judging by the pain, she'd definitely broken at least a toe or two. Her thighs were completely exposed, and the dark purple bruising that completely encircled her right thigh contrasted sharply against her normally fair skin. Her left knee was a deep red color as if something had burned it. She was confused for a moment before remembering that a lot had happened before the wolf had finally run her down. Strangely, she was having trouble remembering much from beforehand. Her more private areas were covered by an almost see-through blood-red lace that wrapped around her an extremely short skirt and matched the color of her hair. It wasn't very private, but it was rich and high class like everything else in the room. Her left side had a thin red scratch running from the middle of her stomach down past her hip. Her chest was equally immodestly covered by the same sort of material that covered her below. She couldn't help but notice that through the material that a jagged white horizontal scar existed where her left nipple would have been. Her face was jaggedly ripped where the wolf had run his claws across it. Only her nose was intact. She sported a jagged and deep reddish scar on her left cheek, with intricate lines of white and red scarring coming from the bottom of her eyes and ending at the top of her cheeks. She obviously didn't have any weapons aside from what was barely hidden under her clothing. A femme fatale such as herself needed nothing more. Admittedly, her injuries would make things more difficult, but she was tough, she was talented, and she knew it. She turned around, facing the door, and taking one last look in the mirror, seeing scratches and scars littering her back. It looked like she'd been whipped 50 times too many. She strode to the door confidently before turning the knob. It was locked, as she'd expected. "It's called a lock, sweetheart," a voice shouted from the other side. "Oh, come on," she called quietly, leaning against the door. "I just wanna..." She paused for a moment. "Stretch my legs," she slurred. Chapter 1. Continued. Caden. 5 minutes. "Look, just let me go in there and talk to her first," Fears pleaded with me. "That doesn't make any sense. I was a superior officer, but we were friends." "Why?" "Because you, sir, are a complete arsehole," he responded gruffly, grabbing my shoulder and stopping our brisk walk. I raised an eyebrow at him, curious as to what he'd do next. At least he'd called me sir. "Caden, please. Just let me ease her into this gently." I started up my gait again. A couple more turns through these damn overly ornate halls, and we might actually reach our destination. I thought about my answer for the next couple of minutes, ignoring the rest of his argument, but pretending to consider it seriously. "Fine. You'll have 5 minutes then," I started to say as we rounded the last corner and saw the guard beginning to unlock the grand door that led to our makeshift jail room. "Private?" I said as the guard dropped his key and jumped out of surprise. He stood to attention, and I began to open my mouth to speak, but Fears' voice came first. "What the hell, Frank?" Fears asked, with his arm slack at his side. It was simple, sweet, and to the point. In fact, it was exactly the same question I was going to ask Frank, minus the military jargon I'd have thrown in. "She just needed to—" Frank started frantically trying to explain himself. He looked about as dumb as he felt. "What?" Fears asked as he walked up to the man, getting ready to drill Frank's ass. "She just needed to escape?" No, sir," he said, shaking his head and staying at attention. I, Fears marked him. "You what? You were just going to unlock the damn door and let her walk?" "No, Fears, I swear I was just—" Frank sternly responded. "I'll tell you what, dickhole." Fears cut him off again. "You're lucky I don't just—" It was my turn to cut Fears off. "Private, you are relieved," I shouted over the sound of Fears yelling and Frank stumbling on his words. Frank looked past Fears and then to me. There was relief in his eyes. Either he'd just pissed himself, or he was overjoyed that I hadn't let Fears finish his sentence. "I am relieved, sir," Frank said quietly before stumbling off. "Caden, I had that handled," Fears said, glaring at me. I responded sternly. 5 minutes, Colonel." He needed a reminder of rank. "Yes, sir," he grumbled, getting ready to open the door. Chapter 1. Continued. Bridget. His dagger. She prepared herself for one hell of an escape. Scarred, scared, and practically naked was not the ideal way to start this sort of thing, but then again she never really did have the ideal starting place at her back. Someone would open the door, and unfortunately from the sounds of the argument, it wasn't going to be a lust-struck guard, but rather a very pissed-off colonel. She walked back over to her bed and daintily sat down, crossed her legs, and folded her hands on her lap. The door burst open as a man she recognized walked through and slammed it behind him angrily. He shook his head a few times exasperatedly, with his hand on his forehead, and sighed. "Colonel Fears," she said as he turned deftly. She had overheard his name from the yelling outside. "Yes, ma'am," he responded, giving her a nonchalant salute. She could tell he wasn't impressed by her outfit. Apparently he hadn't come here to gawk. "And what might I call you?" he asked as he walked casually closer. "Bridget," she responded. "May I stand?" "Yeah," he said, cocking an eyebrow in a confused expression. "Don't see why not," he finished. She stood slowly as he closed the distance between the two of them, leaving only a meter or two. It was close enough for her purposes. He stood at parade rest as he began to speak. "Now, I'm sure you're very curious as to why," but that was all he was able to say. Bridget dropped just enough into a crouch to throw herself forward at him. He may have been off guard, but he was good at his job. He threw his arm forward, trying to catch her, but the sheer force of her crashing into him knocked him onto his back, with her on top of him. She began to rain punches down on his face with her bruised and battered knuckles, fighting through the pain with the adrenaline that was starting to course through her veins. She had only landed a few punches before Fierce threw up his arms, catching a few of the blows with his forearms. The pain of hitting something hard, namely the bones in his arms, caused her to hesitate just long enough for him to roll over and pin her to the ground beneath him. "This is really no way to have a proper conversation," he said as if he was lecturing her. "Now I like you, comma, but," he started to say before her feet wrapped around his throat, pulling him backwards. She was flexible. Normally, Fears would have taken kindly to the fact. However, he did not appreciate being strangled by Bridget's ankles. They continued to wrestle about on the floor until they were meters from the door. This was Bridget's chance. She had him pinned with her elbows driving into his biceps. Her legs crushed his pelvis, and his face was centimeters from hers. "Now this is definitely the way to have a proper conversation," she said, getting ready to make a leap off of him towards the door. She felt something strange pressing against her where her legs had him pinned, and it distracted her for a moment. "Well, somebody's enjoying this a little too much," she said in a flirtatious whisper. "Actually, I'm enjoying this way too much," Fears laughed. "But, honey, that's the hilt of my dagger you're feeling." She looked down, temporarily distracted. There was no dagger. "Okay, so I lied," he chuckled as she looked up, only to have his forehead crash against her nose. Her eyes welled up with tears as hot blood began to trickle from her nose. She released his arms, grasping her face with her hands. The bleeding didn't last long, but that was the least of her worries. Fears reached up with one hand, squeezing her bruised thigh, causing her to lean in that direction before he caught her with a blow to the side of the face with his other hand, knocking her out cold. You see, in a war where the scales were so evenly balanced, the conflict would never have ended. At least that was true after Azela took control of Inara. God only knows what she found in those caves. After all, he hasn't seen fit to tell me as of yet. How then? How to unbalance the scales? For every loss the Alathians suffered, the Inarans suffered one as well. Every gain balanced by a gain. The Alathians almost entirely owned the front, but the Inarans had almost conquered the before. Perhaps, then, the answer lay between the two. The betweens within the between. Humans. The observations of an over-observed observationist. Chapter 1. Continued. Bridget. Bloody dreams. Her head was swimming as if she'd just taken quite a fall. She splashed around in the liquid around her as it threatened to suffocate her. As it turned out, her head wasn't the only thing swimming. She rolled off of her back and onto her knees. The pool around her was somewhere in the neighborhood of a meter deep. She flicked her hands to try and get some of it off, but it was just sticky enough to resist. She rubbed her eyes to try and see clearer, but when she opened them, it stung nonetheless. The air around her was cool, but smelled humid and metallic. The room was dimly lit by torches completely circling the room on the walls. In fact, room was a strange word. It was more of a cavern, really. There were tunnels in the ceiling, through which the smoke from the torches escaped, and through which she had probably fallen. It was only now, when she vaguely heard screams echoing from the tunnels, that she realized what she was kneeling in. It was blood. Blood that matted her hair against her face, blood that dripped from her fingertips, and blood that rained upon her in thick, warm drops from the many small cracks in the ceiling. She looked down at her quaking hands and realized that all of this blood, all of it, was on her hands in more ways than one. "Excellent work, my child," a warm fatherly voice said from behind her. She turned, covering herself up, upon realizing that she wore nothing except for what clung to her from the pool. In effect, the blood had her fully clothed. She stood, walking towards the figure with shaky uncertainty at first. "Where?" she began to ask, but changed her mind. She recognized the wolf, even with his features covered beneath armor, a hood, and blood. "What are you talking about?" "This," he gestured with his arms open. "All of this," he roared, turning completely around as if surveying his kingdom. "And just what is—" She paused before mimicking his gesture. "All of—" she said, spinning around as she moved closer to him, taking in her surroundings. "All of this!" she exclaimed with the slightest traces of disgust. "This," he said, falling to one knee in the blood before drawing some of it up on his right gauntlet-covered hand. "This is true beauty," he snarled as his face half-shifted, and he squeezed his hand into a fist, spraying the blood from it. Bridget continued her slow walk, sloshing her way towards him through the almost knee-deep pool. The warmth between her toes repulsed her, and the blood slipping from her skin made her feel exposed. Her thin, naked frame must not have cut a very intimidating figure, but she strode forward confidently. The wolf stood as she came to a stop just in front of him. "So I did well?" she asked, looking up into his wolf-like eyes. "You performed magnificently, my dear," he said in his fatherly voice as he softly ran his claw along her pronounced and bloodied cheekbones, brushing her wet hair behind her ear. She didn't know how she would look in his eyes. To anyone else she would have been disgusting, but to a creature that craved death? Did he enjoy seeing the blood drip from her long eyelashes and from her chin? Was he excited by the blood that matted her bangs to her face, which tangled her hair and caused it to stick to her back, chest, and shoulders? Would he allow himself to take pleasure from the sight of her exposed breasts and stomach covered only by blood and long hair? Did he study the curve of her petite frame, watching as the warm, thick liquid rolled down past her waistline and suggestively further, until it rolled down her legs in small drops and intricate rivers? She almost doubted it. She heard the stunned yelp of the man behind her before hearing two very distinct plops as two people fell from one of the tunnels into the pool. She didn't allow herself to be distracted as the wolf looked past her. She pressed her right hand to his chest. She was stunned by the warmth of his skin as she opened her eyes widely. A strange sinking feeling passed through what she could only describe as her soul, as the blood in her body seemed to catch fire and boil. She concentrated on her hand as the wolf returned his eyes to her, He glared and snarled as an intense heat shot from her hand and burst into the wolf's chest. He cried out in something between a howl of anger and pain before backhanding her in the chest so hard that she flew a good 2 meters. She felt the cracking of the bones in her chest from the impact of his hand, and the almost full snapping occurred upon her landing on her back, underwater, so to speak. Bridget gasped from underneath the blood, inhaled it, and then proceeded to sit up, sending her into a rage of coughs and spasms as the ragged coughing sent agony through her chest. She fell onto her side with a splash, unable to stay on her hands and knees. When she had finally pulled herself together enough to get back on her knees, she saw the wolf in a similar position, with a gaping hole in his chest. He exhaled raggedly as he fell onto his back, disappearing into the pool. "Bridget!" The call came from behind her. She recognized the voice, followed by the sound of a man splashing through the blood behind her. She turned to see Fears, who looked conflicted, but happy to see her. He took off his cloak as he approached. Even though it was soaked, it was some amount of cover. He threw it around her before giving her a firm push against her chest. She cried out as her ribs took the impact. "Tell me what's going on," he said, his expression changing to rage. She was as confused as he was, and in much more pain. "Explain!" he yelled, stamping a foot down and into the blood, splashing it everywhere. "Fears!" the second man bellowed. He was on his feet, the blood sliding off of his armor as if he was dispelling it. "What?" Fears growled as he turned to face the man. Fears's face was covered with blood, and his long black hair was coated in it. With more blood dripped out of his thin black beard. He looked like a madman. "Move," the other commanded. Caden's eyes were glowing icy blue. His short brown hair had beads of blood dripping from it and down his face. His thick, light brown goatee was only lightly stained by the blood. He looked cold, unmoved, and emotionless. Everything about him was best described by frozen and calm. "Or what, Caden?" Fears demanded. "You'll kill me?" He laughed, gesturing to himself. "Yes," Caden said with no amount of uncertainty. Fears stopped laughing and stood in front of Bridget, with his hands gesturing her to stay behind him. She obeyed. She watched from behind him as Caden took a step forward. "I need to know!" Fears yelled. "She did it," Caden responded flatly. "I will kill her." Caden growled. "Let me speak to her," Fears pleaded. "I'll be doing it now," Caden said in the same tone as the blue mist formed around his left hand, swirling before shaping itself into a small throwing knife made of ice. "No!" Fears roared. Caden only responded by forming another knife in his right hand. "One for each of us," she concluded. He wouldn't hesitate. Bridget saw it in his eyes. Fears either didn't notice or didn't care. Bridget dropped her cloak as she wrapped her arms around Fears' stomach. She threw him to the ground, falling with him. Fears splashed about in the blood as Bridget pushed herself onto her knees behind him. Suddenly she felt herself scream and arc her back as she cried out to the ceiling. Finally she realized it was a knife in her back, and as she tried to reach behind herself with her right hand to pull it out of her lower back, she cried out and tugged on the hilt as tears streamed from her eyes. She gasped for breath as her strength failed and she fell to her hands. She saw Fear staring up at her from the pool. He lunged forward, bracing her with his body before she could fall face first into oblivion. "Bridget," he said softly, holding her face so that she was looking into his eyes. She stared at him, feeling the pain fade. "Fears," she said softly. She screamed, and her words turned into a cry as she fell forward onto Fears' shoulder after taking a second dagger to the same area. He would have killed us both," she sobbed. Her strength was gone, and her eyes fell closed. She felt herself fall into the blood. It engulfed her, choking out her cries as her spasms became weak twitches. The only thing left between her and oblivion was the lingering thought. It was the knowledge that he would have killed them both. I looked out into the deep fog, as if straining my eyes would reveal more. "Is it natural?" the woman next to me asked as she cradled her baby in her arms. The child was asleep, along with everybody except the 20 men I'd brought with me. The village was well designed for our circumstance. It was small, it was sparsely populated, it was hidden, and it was backed up right against the steepest damn cliff I'd ever seen. There were 5 houses left that held 4 or 5 village residents maximum each. I had made repeated and elongated visits to this village since I'd arrived at the castle. It was my base of operations. I was out here in the woods to rescue and recruit whole men and women with both the heart and strength of will to join our cause against the wretched wolf, as the high priest had put it. I summarized the mission to my men as, we're out here to find anybody with enough balls to swing a sword at whoever we tell him to. Almost a year later, we had almost 700 strong, still pretending to live normal lives, just waiting for the call. I stood now on the porch of the only house that stood in front of our barricade. It was meant to be a scout's post, a suicide post, almost. I had only been gone a day or two since we'd brought back the fiery redhead. My journeys out here were becoming more frequent, but less lengthy. As such, my plan was to be heading home early tomorrow morning. "Caden," the woman asked with a little more urgency. Her presence here alone with me attested to the fact that I was growing far too fond of her and her child. "Is it natural?" she asked again, referring to the fog. "Of course it is," I said, looking at her with a reassuring smile. "Now come on," I said, forcing myself to turn away from the fog as I led her inside. I knew that the fog was far from natural, and she did too. We chose blissful ignorance over the truth as I guided her inside. Unfortunately, it was going to be a long night. I didn't know why I'd allowed her to come with me when I took the suicide post. She couldn't fight, and above all that, I was putting the child in danger. Yet knowing that we both understood the risks, I'd gone with it anyway. People died in war, and honestly, I think we both preferred the idea of dying next to somebody we cared about, on whatever small level. She'd already put the child into the makeshift cradle that was set next to a pile of hay that passed for a bed. She beckoned me to join her on the bed, and for a moment I seriously considered the offer, but I had work to do. I promised myself I'd take the time to lay with her after this was all over, assuming we both survived. I paused a moment at the door, my right hand resting on the hilt of my sword that was still hanging from my hip. She looked so peaceful. For as long as I'd known her, she'd represented a life that I knew I wouldn't have, but that didn't keep me from longing for it at times. Alas, I was a soldier, and that was all I was. I didn't have so much memory of anything before the war, nor did I really remember much of the beginning of the war, but as the saying went, wherever I was, there I was. Nothing else really mattered. I tugged softly on the door, forcing myself to tear my gaze away from her. I glanced at her child, imagining how it would have felt to be the father. Those were my last peaceful thoughts of the night, as the door suddenly slammed against me, knocking me onto my ass. In the doorway stood the dark figure of the wolf, venom dripping from its long canines as its nails turned to elongated claws. In times past, I had been taken aback by its appearance, but I was beyond that now. I pushed myself onto my feet, unsheathing my sword with my left hand and taking a wild horizontal swing at its stomach. His reaction, however, was far too quick for me as he jumped back through the doorway. I was briefly aware of the child screaming and the woman jumping to her feet in my peripheral vision. I took the momentum of my failed slash and turned it into a pointed and well-executed stab at his chest. He pivoted on his left foot, allowing the stab to go past him. My momentum this time carried me forward half a step too far. Rather than trying to backpedal, which I knew would only end in my slipping, I threw myself forward, then did a 360 turn while swinging my sword horizontally from left to right. This time he had nowhere to go, so he didn't go anywhere. He caught my blade in the claws of his right hand. Before I could come up with a reaction, he snapped my blade with the slightest flick of his wrist. I didn't allow myself to be stunned for long. I yelled as I threw my right fist forward, but my battle cry caught in my throat as the wolf's left hand shot up around my neck so quickly that it felt as though I'd been punched. He then proceeded to pull me forward, slamming my face directly into the thick wooden door frame. The force of the impact shattered my nose completely and sent alternated streaks of light and utter blackness whirling through my vision. I was on my back when I had the chance to clear my vision. All I heard was screaming, crying, and the damn wolf complimenting my fighting, whilst chastising me for being a little on the uncontrolled side. I rolled onto my stomach to stop the blood from choking its way down my throat. I got to my hands and knees before I was able to wrap my hand around what was left of my sword. Finally, with some sense of equilibrium returning, I turned around, still on my knees in time to see the wolf standing in the doorway, with the still screaming child in its arms. "I believe this belongs to me now," he said, smiling down at the child as his face reverted to a more human shape. Blood still poured from my face, streaming from my nose in a torrent. I tried lunging forward at him, only to catch his right boot with the side of my face. The blow left me rolling across the mud. "That is exactly what I'm talking about, Caden," the wolf said in a fatherly tone. "Control is important," he said, walking away from the house. Apparently the lesson was over. My first thought was for the child, but I knew I couldn't save her. My next rational thought was for the woman still inside. I couldn't be sure that she was alive, but I didn't think she was dead. The defense of the village was not my top priority. The lives of my men concerned me, but I'd brought them along because I knew they could handle themselves. The woman inside the house couldn't. Luckily, defending the house she was in served the purpose of a frontline soldier just as it protected her. I stood in the doorway, looking back into the fog. The wolf was gone, although I knew an attack was coming. I could feel it. It felt like an eternity before I finally heard the snarling of the first wave coming to the attack. I took a deep breath. My men were trained for this. "To arms!" I yelled into the otherwise quiet night. "To the front!" My men would interpret front to mean the barricade, which was where I should have been. Which was good. I didn't want them to die out here just because I refused to leave the woman. Before we talk about the end, we should of course talk about the beginning, however preciously little there is to say. What started the war? No one knows. The universe before has little left to be known about it. Ha! But there is little point to speak of what we do not know. Instead, let us therefore concentrate on what we do. In what would become the end of days for a universe unknowingly at its end, two great powers dallied with a force better left undallied, namely that of time. What existed in that place before? Perhaps Skeltus knows, maybe the Masquerade, however uninclined they are to share anything. But in the end, I'm not even sure God knows. Do you suppose that's possible? For God to not know something? Oh, of course not. The observations of an over-observed observationist. Chapter 1. Continued. Bridget. Trappings of Pride. Bridget awoke from her dream covered in sweat. Blood was seeping from her more major injuries. She summed it all up to nothing more than a post-traumatic reaction. It was like a dream that her mind had constructed based on her more recent fears and feelings. She wasn't sure what that implied about fears, but she rather liked the idea of fire coming from her hands at her command. She finally decided to open her eyes, and much to her surprise, found herself still in the same luxurious room. She had expected something closer to a cell. That being so, she wasn't too surprised to find her hands tied to the bedposts and her feet tied together. She sat up a little bit, and found the colonel sitting in a plain and simple chair at the foot of the bed. His longer brown hair was pulled back into a ponytail, leaving only a few stray strands on his face. His thin, light brown, almost blonde beard lightly covered his sharp features. He definitely looked more put together when he wasn't enraged and covered in blood. His attire had changed entirely from their last meeting. She guessed that his current outfit was for battle, or formal occasions, or maybe even both. He wore a dark brown, hard leather breastplate with steel on the pectorals and abs. The steel was a darker silver color with blue trimmings throughout. His legs were covered by simple pants with steel shin guards and steel covering his thighs. All of the steel was outlined by the same blue lines. He wore a leather belt, with a sword resembling that of a Roman gladius hanging in a sheath on the left side and a long knife on the right. Over all of this, he wore a dark blue cloak. Judging by the bracer on his left arm, she guessed that he was more of an archer, despite his blades. She tugged on the ropes a couple of times to get his attention. "Kinky," she said, gesturing her head towards the ropes. "Though I'd much rather have you wearing less—" She paused for a moment as he stood, and she looked him up and down. "Well, less in general," she ceded. "Fetish or precaution?" "Trust me," he said, placing his hands on his hips, making direct eye contact. "I wish the situation was different, but last time you were untied—" He paused for a moment, drawing his knife. "I kind of had to break your nose to stop your little escape attempt," he finished as he toyed with the point. "So if I promise to be a good girl?" Bridget began, shifting seductively on the sheets. As beaten and battered as she was, Fierce was still finding himself terribly attracted to her. "Shut up for a minute, will you?" he said abruptly. "Let me be very clear," he said as he walked up to the left side of the bed and knelt down so his face was almost touching hers. "You're a very attractive woman, and for some reason, from where I'm kneeling, the scars are just adding to the overall sexy and seductive effect." He paused for a moment, but Bridget hadn't even flinched. "Now, if I were an enlisted man, I might consider taking full advantage of the tied-up, scantily clad, seemingly sex-crazed woman in front of me." He stood again and turned away from her, staring out the window nearest to the bed. "Unfortunately, I am an officer in this fine little army." He started a bit of a crescendo as his voice grew louder with every word. He turned around as he spoke. "And my orders do not include fucking the hot lady that only wants me because she thinks she can seduce me into letting her go." he finished this time, leaning over her. "Am I clear, Bridget?" he asked in a sharp military tone. "So, if I promise to be a bad girl?" she asked with as much smart-ass as she could. Fears was silent for a few seconds before speaking again. She wasn't really sure what to expect. She didn't really care. "You're incorrigible," he growled before standing up to his full height. She thought for a moment that he was trying to hold back a smile. Apparently she was right, as he burst into laughter, turning away from her again. "My God, I really like you," he laughed, trying to control himself. "You're like a—" He paused for a moment, catching his breath. "You're like a bangable Caden," he exclaimed. "It's ridiculous," he said, shaking his head as he walked away from the bed. "We're talking about asshole Caden, right?" Bridget asked, propping her head up to keep looking at Fears as he continued to walk away. "You haven't even met the man," Fears said, sounding a little thrown. "What makes you think he's an ass?" Bridget paused for a moment, remembering that her only impression of the man was from some stranger-than-shit delirious dream. "He's less of an asshole once you get him drunk. And there's not a war going on." Fears stopped in his tracks, rethinking his statement. "Mostly when he's drunk, though." Bridget was still trying to get a handle on whatever the hell had just happened when Fears reapproached the foot of the bed. "Listen," he said, placing his hands on the bed and leaning forward. "Not really a prisoner." "Could have fooled me," Bridget sassed as she feigned trying to move her arms around. "Think of it as being held for questioning," Fears retorted. "Anyways, there's a big council meeting going on once Caden gets back. Something about him getting his arse handed to him by the wolf while he was out in the woods." "And that means anything to me because?" Bridget asked curiously. "Shut up and I'll tell you," Fears said jokingly. That was the second time he'd told her to shut up, and for some reason she found it kind of attractive, but she quickly ignored the thought. "All we want to do is find out what you were doing in the woods, and why you were doing the tango with the wolf, and, more importantly, how the hell you're still alive." "I don't even know the answer to that," Bridget interjected as Fears walked up to the side of the bed again. "I don't care," Fears said, sounding slightly exasperated. "Caring about answers isn't my job. Getting you to the meeting is." Bridget still seemed hesitant. "Look, how about I phrase this differently?" Fears said, sitting on the bed next to her. "There's going to be a magnificent party. Big, shiny council room, and I'm only invited if I bring an attractive +1. And after we're done with the council, I'll give you a grand tour, tell you what we're all about. If you have fun, or you just think your date was ridiculously attractive," he said jokingly, "then you can decide to stay. If you hate it, you can go back to scampering about through the woods." He looked at her, trying to get a read on what she was thinking. "Deal?" he finally asked. "What should I wear?" she responded lightheartedly. Fears refused to take the opportunity to gaze at the rest of her body. "Exactly what you're wearing now," he said, looking her in the eyes. "Or less," he finished with a wink. She raised her eyebrow at him, as if to say, "Seriously?" "Ah," he said, pausing for a moment. "You mean before the private after-party?" She couldn't help but laugh at his brazenness. He was refreshingly confident. "Yes, Colonel," she responded with feigned disdain. "Before your imaginary after-party." "I'll look for some clothes under the bed," he said as he stood and sheathed his knife, heading for the door. Forgetting anything?" she said, shaking her arms at him. He chuckled, covering his eyes with his right hand before taking a deep breath. "I figured out a way out of those 20 seconds after you woke up," he said, looking up at her with a half-smile. "What has you in such an infallibly good mood?" she asked, remembering the man who'd stormed into the room the first time. "I'm always in a good mood when Caden gets his arse kicked," Fears said over his shoulder as he turned the handle on the door and swung it open. It wasn't the answer she was looking for, but it was all she was going to get out of him. He walked about halfway through the doorway before Bridget yelled after him, 17 seconds! He stopped and looked back at her. "Listen," he said with a grin, "you seem like you're really good, but I doubt you're that good," he finished before slamming the door behind him. The room was completely silent again for the next few moments as Bridget reflected on the encounter. She decided that she kind of liked Fears, and she'd give this whole thing a shot, though she was a bit too prideful to consider immediately admitting that to him. Her biggest problem was going to be getting out of her It's definitely going to be her newfound memory loss once the council started asking her questions. Her second largest problem, however, was a bit more presently concerning. "How the hell am I going to get out of these?" she thought to herself as she flailed for a moment, trying to get free of her bonds. "Damn pride.